Welcome back to the study. The fire has been kept alive for you. Leave the relentless, exhausting pace of the modern world outside the door. Shake the cold rain from your coat. Pull your chair closer to the hearth and allow the heavy, unbroken silence of this room to settle around your shoulders once again. There is no haste here. There are no deadlines. There is only the steady passage of time, marked by the slow burning of the candle and the rhythmic beating of the rain against the window pane. In our previous session, we opened the great, dust-covered ledger of Arda. We mapped the physical, historical, and linguistic architecture of Middle-earth. We traced the incredible deep roots of its ruins. We listened to the cosmic, shattering symphony of its creation. And we examined the strict, uncompromising philosophy of subcreation that allowed John Ronald Reuel Tolkien to forge a myth that feels terrifyingly real. We looked at the world from a towering, godlike perspective. But to truly understand the enduring, heartbreaking power of this mythology, we must now step away from the grand geography of its continents. We must leave behind the sweeping histories of the First and Second Ages. Tonight, we must examine a far more treacherous, far more terrifying landscape. We must put away our compasses and our rulers, and we must attempt to map the deeply flawed, terribly fragile architecture of the human soul. When we consume modern pop culture, when we read contemporary fantasy novels, when we sit in darkened movie theaters, or when we play sprawling video games, we are heavily, almost aggressively conditioned to expect a very specific, mechanical formula for our heroes. This formula is so deeply ingrained in our collective subconscious that we rarely even notice it operating. The comparative mythologist Joseph Campbell famously outlined it in his seminal work, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. He called it the monomyth, the hero's journey. Through decades of this cinematic and literary conditioning, we have been taught that the ultimate, unbeatable weapon against darkness is the protagonist's sheer, unbreakable willpower. We expect the hero to be reluctant at first, yes. We expect them to face trials, to cross the threshold into the unknown, and to suffer agonizing losses. We expect them to be battered, bruised, and pushed to the absolute bleeding edge of their physical and emotional limits. But crucially, we also carry an unshakable expectation regarding the climax. We believe, with absolute certainty, that in the final, desperate second, when the sky is dark and all hope seems lost, the hero will dig deep within their spirit, find a hidden, miraculous reserve of righteous strength, and overcome the evil. We expect the music to swell into a triumphant crescendo. We expect the hero to set their jaw, look the Dark Lord in the eye, and cast the cursed artifact into the flames through pure, unadulterated moral superiority. And this is the legacy of the classical heroes. This is Beowulf plunging into the underwater lair to slay Grendel's mother. This is King Arthur drawing the sword from the stone. It is the archetype of the sovereign, triumphant will conquering the insurmountable obstacle. Tolkien knew these ancient archetypes intimately. He was, after all, a professor of Anglo-Saxon literature. He translated Beowulf. He understood the mechanics of the classical hero better than anyone alive in the 20th century. And yet, when it came time to write the climax of his own life's work, he deliberately, painstakingly dismantled this illusion. He did not write a comfortable, conventional climax, because Tolkien was not just a scholar of ancient myth. He was a survivor of the modern, industrialized nightmare. He was a veteran of the First World War. He had stood in the apocalyptic, rat-infested trenches of the Somme. He had watched an entire generation of young, hopeful, morally upright men be fed into the grinding, mechanical maw of artillery fire and mustard gas. In the trenches of Flanders, Tolkien learned a brutal, unflinching truth about the nature of evil and the terrifying limitations of mortal endurance. He learned that heroism is not a magical shield. He learned that a man cannot simply will himself through a barrage of high explosive shells. There is a point where the physical body and the human mind simply break. No matter how pure your heart is, no matter how noble your intentions are, if you are subjected to an overwhelming, crushing, continuous force, you will eventually collapse. Willpower is a finite resource. This grim, realistic understanding of trauma and endurance is the true, hidden foundation of The Lord of the Rings. And so, we must look at the ring-bearer, Frodo Baggins. It is entirely by design that the fate of the world is not placed upon the broad, armored shoulders of Aragorn or Boromir or Glorfindel. If a classical martial hero had taken the ring, the quest would have failed within a matter of days. The ring feeds on ambition. It feeds on the desire to do great deeds, to order the world, to conquer, and to protect. A warrior king would have claimed it almost immediately, convinced by the whispers of the shadow that he could use it for the greater good. Frodo is chosen precisely because he is a hobbit. He represents the ultimate everyman. He is a gentle, scholarly soul who desires nothing more than a quiet life, a good book, and the green hills of the Shire. He has no grand ambitions for the ring to latch onto. But even an empty vessel, if placed under a cosmic, crushing pressure for long enough, will eventually shatter. The journey to Mount Doom is not a traditional adventure. It is not a sequence of exciting skirmishes and heroic duels. As Frodo and Sam progress further into the ash and dust of Mordor, the narrative shifts into a grueling, suffocating study of psychological decay and terminal exhaustion. The ring is not merely a heavy piece of jewelry. As they draw closer to the heart of the Sauron's realm, it becomes a physical manifestation of gravity. It is an active, malignant radiation that continuously, relentlessly attacks the mind. Tolkien describes it as a wheel of fire in Frodo's mind, slowly burning away everything else. Frodo loses the memory of the taste of food. He loses the memory of the sound of water. He forgets the faces of his friends, and he forgets the green grass of his home. He is stripped to nothing but a raw, agonizing nerve of pure endurance. He is marching through an active war zone of the soul. He performs a task of such staggering, immense difficulty that neither Elrond nor Galadriel nor Gandalf the White would have even dared to attempt it. He carries the concentrated malice of an angelic being into the very forge of its creation. And yet, the truth of this mythological masterpiece culminates in a moment that still shocks, confuses, and frustrates many casual readers today. At the very end of all things, standing on the precipice of the crack of doom in the suffocating, sulphurous heat of the volcano, after enduring unimaginable starvation, after crawling on his hands and knees through the ash, after carrying the fate of the entire world across a hostile continent, Frodo Baggins fails. He does not heroically cast the ring into the fire. He stands at the edge of the abyss, looks into the roaring flames, and the last microscopic thread of his willpower finally, completely snaps. "I have come," he says, his voice ringing out with a sudden, unnatural clarity above the roar of the mountain. "But I do not choose now to do what I came to do. I will not do this deed. The ring is mine." And he puts it on. He claims it. He succumbs utterly and entirely to the shadow. To a modern audience, addicted to the illusion of the invincible hero, this feels like a betrayal of the narrative promise. It feels like a devastating flaw. We ask ourselves, why did we follow him for over 1,000 pages? Why did we endure all this sorrow and hardship alongside him, if he was just going to surrender at the very last second? But tonight, as we watch the shadows dance across the walls of this study, we will dissect this moment with the precision of a philosopher. We will discover why Frodo's ultimate failure is not a mistake. We will see that it is, in fact, Tolkien's absolute crowning masterpiece of psychological, moral, and theological realism. We will discover why no mortal mind, be it man, elf, dwarf, or hobbit, could have ever withstood the final concentrated gravity of the ring at the point of its maximum power. We will explore the terrifying anatomy of the shadow and the crushing mechanics of despair. And most importantly, we will answer the profound question that lies at the very heart of this myth. If strength is finite, if willpower is an illusion, and if the hero is destined to fall, what is it that actually saves the world? Prepare yourself, for we are about to step into the dark. Before we can truly comprehend the tragedy of Frodo Baggins, and before we can understand the absolute inevitability of his failure at the crack of doom, we must first dispel a terrible misconception. We must redefine our understanding of what evil actually is within the architecture of Middle-earth. In the shallow waters of modern pop culture, evil is almost always presented as a caricature. It is easy identifiable, usually dressed in black, adorned with spikes and accompanied by a booming, maniacal laugh. Modern villains are often depicted as agents of pure, chaotic destruction who desire suffering simply for the sake of suffering. They offer their followers nothing but pain, fear, and death. Because of the cinematic adaptation, it is incredibly easy for a casual observer to look at Sauron, the Dark Lord of Mordor, and place him perfectly within this simplistic category. He sits atop a dark tower in a wasteland of ash, commanding armies of monstrous orcs. He is the ultimate terrifying boogeyman. But this external, militaristic view of Sauron is merely the surface. It is the armor. To find the true essence of Sauron, to understand the actual terrifying mechanics of the shadow, we must look at the artifact into which he poured his cruelty, his malice, and his will to dominate all life. We must look at the One Ring. And when we examine the ring closely, we discover a chilling truth. The ring does not tempt its victims with visions of blood, slaughter, and ruin. It does not whisper in their ears, urging them to become cackling, malicious villains. No, the most terrifying aspect of the shadow and the Tolkien's mythology is that it tempts you with the promise of doing good. Tolkien was a man of profound Catholic faith, and his understanding of evil was deeply rooted in the theology of St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. In this classical, philosophical framework, evil is not a substance in and of itself. Evil does not possess its own independent creative existence. It is not an equal and opposite force to good. Instead, evil is defined as privatio boni, the privation or the absence of good. It is a corruption, a parasite, a disease that feeds upon healthy organisms. Remember our previous chapter, when we discussed the music of the Ainur. Melkor, the first Dark Lord, could not create anything new. He could only mock, twist, and distort the beautiful music that Eru Ilúvatar had already established. He took the majestic, freezing cold and twisted it into bitter, biting frost. He took the noble, fierce heat and perverted it into consuming, destructive fire. Orcs are not an original creation. They are ruined, tortured elves. The One Ring operates on this exact same insidious principle. It is a spiritual parasite. It does not need to insert evil desires into your heart. It simply takes the noble, righteous, and beautiful desires that are already there, and it slowly twists them into a grotesque parody of themselves. It weaponizes your own morality against you. To understand this mechanic, we must observe how the ring interacts with the greatest and wisest minds in Middle-earth. We must look at the ones who categorically refused to take it. Consider Gandalf the Grey. When Frodo, terrified by the revelation of the ring's true nature, in the quiet safety of the Bag End, offers the ring to the wizard, Gandalf reacts not with casual dismissal, but with a genuine, visceral panic. "Do not tempt me," Gandalf cries out, "for I do not wish to become like the Dark Lord himself. Yet the way of the ring to my heart is by pity. Pity for weakness and the desire of strength to do good. Do not tempt me." Gandalf is a Maya, an angelic being sent by the gods to guide and protect the free peoples of Middle-earth. His defining characteristic is his boundless pity and his profound love for the weak and the marginalized. He loves the hobbits precisely because they are small and overlooked by the great powers of the world. If Gandalf were to take the ring, he would not immediately transform into a tyrant who revels in torture. He would take the ring with the absolute, unshakable intention of saving the world. He would use it an unimaginable power to instantly destroy Sauron, to heal the burned lands, and to feed the starving. But power, by its very nature, demands control. In order to ensure that no one ever suffered again, Gandalf would have to begin enforcing his vision of goodness upon everyone else. To eliminate conflict, he would have to eliminate free will. He would dictate what is right and what is wrong, and he would crush any dissent, all in the name of peace. Tolkien wrote in one of his letters that a ring-wielding Gandalf would have been a tyrant far worse than Sauron. Sauron rules through fear and physical coercion. His evil is obvious, and therefore it can be resisted in the heart. But Gandalf would rule through a suffocating, enforced benevolence. He would make good seem detestable. He would create a sterile, authoritarian hospital where the patients are kept perfectly safe, but are entirely unfree. The ring would take his beautiful divine pity and twist it into absolute tyrannical control. Now, let us travel to the golden woods of Lothlorien and examine the temptation of the Lady Galadriel. Galadriel is one of the oldest living beings in Middle-earth. She was born in the Undying Lands, and she remembers the light of the two trees before the First Age even began. But Galadriel's history is not entirely pure. Thousands of years ago, she joined the rebellion of the elves and left the heavenly realm because she possessed a deep, burning ambition. She wanted a realm of her own to rule. She wanted to be a queen. When Frodo freely offers her the One Ring, the temptation is cosmic in scale. The ring holds up a mirror to her soul and shows her the realization of a 7,000-year-old dream. She speaks of what she would become, not dark, but beautiful and terrible as the morning and the night, fair as the sea and the sun and the snow upon the mountain, dreadful as the storm and the lightning, stronger than the foundations of the earth. All shall love me and despair. Notice the language she uses. The ring does not offer her a kingdom of ash and shadows. It offers her an empire of absolute, terrifying beauty. It promises to make her a goddess, but it is a beauty that demands worship. All shall love me and despair. To be loved so intensely and to be so far above your subjects that their only possible reaction to your perfection is absolute crushing despair, is the ultimate manifestation of megalomania. It is the ego expanding until it suffocates the entire world. Galadriel passes the test not by overpowering the ring with force, but by surrendering. She accepts that the time of the elves is over. She lets go of her ancient ambition. I will diminish, she says, her voice returning to a soft, sad whisper. I will diminish and go into the west and remain Galadriel. By refusing the ring, she accepts the fading of her people and the loss of her beloved forest. She chooses the tragedy of mortality over the tyranny of absolute power. And then we have the tragedy of mortal men. We have Boromir of Gondor. Boromir is frequently misunderstood by readers and viewers as a weak or inherently corrupt man. He is neither. Boromir is a fiercely loyal, incredibly brave patriot. He is the firstborn son of the Steward of Gondor, A captain who has spent his entire adult life fighting a desperate, losing, bloody war on the very borders of Mordor to keep the darkness from swallowing the rest of the world. He, he has watched his friends die, he has watched his city crumble, and he is carrying the crushing weight of his people's impending doom on his shoulders. When Boromir looks at the ring, he does not see a tool for evil. He sees salvation. The ring preys upon his desperation and his noble love for his country. It whispers to him, "Why hide this weapon? Why send it into the fire with a weak little hobbit? Take it. Command the armies of Gondor. Drive the enemy back. Become a glorious, victorious king. Save your people." The ring takes his purest virtue, the willingness to die for his city, and twists it into violence. It convinces him that the end justifies the means. It convinces him that trying to take the ring from Frodo by force is not an act of betrayal, but an act of grim, necessary duty to the greater good. Boromir falls because he is desperate to do the right thing, and the shadow provides him with the ultimate poisonous shortcut. This is the anatomy of the shadow. It is not a monster hiding under the bed. It is a flawless silver mirror that reflects your highest ideals, your deepest loves, and your most noble intentions, and then, slowly, methodically, perverts them into a mechanism of control. Power, in the philosophy of Middle-earth, is inherently corrupting because it fundamentally requires the subjugation of the will of the others. To wield the ring is to impose your will upon the fabric of reality, and no mortal, nor immortal, possesses the moral perfection required to do that without eventually becoming a tyrant. So, what happens when this ultimate machine of corruption, this spiritual parasite that feeds on ambition and the desire to change the world, is given to someone who possesses neither? What happens when you give the ring to a creature who does not wish to be a Dark Lord, who does not wish to be a benevolent dictator, who does not wish to become a radiant queen, and who does not even wish to be a glorious captain? What happens when you give it to a gentle, quiet soul who only wants to read maps, smoke pipeweed, and tend to a garden in the Shire? The ring cannot immediately corrupt Frodo Baggins, because there is no grand ambition for it to latch onto. There is no hook. The hobbit's soul is too small, too grounded, and too remarkably content for the grand lies of the ring to take immediate root. But the shadow is patient, and it is relentless. If it cannot corrupt a mind through grand ambition, it will simply attempt to crush it through sheer, agonizing physical and spiritual attrition. The ring could not turn Frodo into a tyrant, so instead it began the slow, torturous process of grinding him into dust. It subjected him to a test of endurance so extreme, so unfathomably cruel, that the outcome was decided long before he ever set foot on the slopes of Mount Doom. Let us now examine the mechanics of that final, grueling march, and discover why the cracking of Frodo's will was an absolute mathematical certainty. We must now venture deeper into the ash. We must leave behind the philosophical abstractions of temptation and the grand profiles of ancient queens, and we must walk alongside the ring-bearer across the barren, jagged wastes of the plateau of Gorgoroth. To truly comprehend why the War of the Ring could not be won by a display of traditional heroism, we must analyze the grueling, clinical mechanics of what Tolkien constructed, not as a moral trial, but as an absolute endurance test. In the vast landscape of literary analysis, critics frequently make the fatal mistake of treating Frodo Baggins' journey as a metaphor for a standard psychological struggle. They speak of the ring as if it were a representation of addiction or ambition, or the ordinary human capacity for sin. They analyze Frodo's progressive decay as a gradual failure of character, a slow erosion of his personal virtue under the weight of a difficult choice. But this interpretation completely, fundamentally misunderstands the physics of Tolkien's universe. The One Ring is not a static object that simply sits in a pocket, waiting to be used. It is an active, localized concentration of the spiritual malice of a fallen angelic being. It is an entity that possesses its own malevolent mass, its own independent gravity, and its own unyielding will. And as the bird draws closer to the Samath Naur, the fiery crucible where the ring was forged, its power does not increase linearly. It intensifies exponentially. It behaves less like a toy and more like a crushing, inescapable gravitational field. Tolkien, drawing directly upon his harrowing experiences in the mud of the Western Front, designed the ring's influence as an exercise in total psychological attrition. There is a profound architectural difference between a sudden, sharp temptation and a continuous, unyielding pressure. If a man is offered a massive bribe to betray his country, he faces a sharp moral crisis. He can summon his integrity, steel his resolve, and says no. The temptation arrives, it tests his boundaries, and it passes. The will acts as a shield, deflecting the blow. But the ring does not strike a single blow. It does not engage in a duel of wits. The ring is a continuous, uninterrupted, and escalating radiation that assaults the bearer's nervous system every single second of every single day. It does not sleep. It does not pause. It does not grant the mind of a single moment of sanctuary or rest. It is a slow, relentless pressure applied to a structural beam. And as any structural engineer will tell you, if you apply enough weight to a support beam for a long enough period of time, the question is never if the beam will buckle. The question is exclusively when. Tolkien addressed this specific theological mechanic in one of his most deeply personal and important documents, letter number 246, writing to a reader who expressed confusion and disappointment over Frodo's failure at the crack of doom. The professor stepped forward not to condemn his protagonist, but to passionately defend his absolute sanctity. In this letter, Tolkien outlines a crucial philosophical distinction between a moral failure and the total collapse of capacity. He explicitly states that Frodo's surrender to the ring at the very edge of the abyss was not a sin. It was not a failure of his moral will. It was instead a point of absolute physical and psychological exhaustion. The professor wrote that at the final moment, the power of the ring had become supreme. It had reached its absolute maximum potential. operating within the very heart of its own domain, entirely saturated by the immediate presence of Sauron's waking mind. For a mortal creature to voluntarily cast the ring into the fire at that specific geographic coordinate was not merely difficult, it was theologically and mathematically impossible. The pressure applied to Frodo's soul had simply exceeded the maximum threshold of what a created, finite mind could physically bear. To illustrate this, Tolkien invites us to look at the real world. He asks us to consider the reality of physical torture, or the catastrophic psychological breakdown known in his era as shell shock, and known to us today as severe trauma. If a soldier is captured by the enemy and subjected to weeks of systematic, brutal torture, there will inevitably come a moment where his mind breaks. He will give up the codes, he will sign the confession, he will betray his comrades. When this happens, a civilized society does not look at that broken soldier and brand him a coward or a traitor. We do not judge him as if he made a free, conscious moral choice to evil. We recognize that this biological and psychological machinery was subjected to a force that shattered his capacity for agency. His will was not corrupted, it was simply neutralized. Frodo Baggins did not walk into Mordor as a mythic hero. He walked into it as a soldier marching into a continuous, multi-month artillery barrage of the soul. By the time he reaches the slopes of Mount Doom, he is no longer a complete person. The ring has systematically hollowed him out. It has burned away his memories, his desires, his personality, and his hope. He is operating entirely on the raw, mechanical momentum of his love for Sam and his residual sense of duty. He has given 99% of his entire being to the quest. He has endured a weight that would have crushed a line of legendary kings with a fraction of the distance. But the ring demands the final 1%. When Frodo stands inside the Samath Naur, he is standing at ground zero. The ring is no longer whispering, it is shouting with the voice of a god. The temptation is no longer an abstract thought of doing good. It is an active, physical command ripping through his brain. At that precise moment, his free will ceases to function. The ring overrides his agency entirely, latching onto the final, primitive survival instinct of the ego. Frodo's proclamation that "the ring is mine" is not a declaration of wicked intent. It is the involuntary scream of a drowning man whose head is finally forced beneath the water after fighting the current for miles. It is the breaking of the beam under a mountain of stone. This is the severe, uncompromising realism of Tolkien's world building. He built a universe where heroes are allowed to break. He rejected the cheap, commercial lie that pure intentions are an infinite shield against the dark. He knew that we are created finite and fragile things, and that there are forces in the dark world that are fundamentally larger than us. In The Lord of the Rings, if The Lord of the Rings had ended with Frodo successfully conquering his temptation through a final burst of heroic willpower, the entire inner consistency of the reality would have been destroyed. The ring would have been revealed as a weak, insignificant threat, a minor obstacle that could be overcome by a stout heart and a noble speech. Sauron's malice would have been minimized. The tragedy of the war would have been reduced to a simple children's fable. By ensuring that Frodo failed, Tolkien maintained the terrifying, majestic power of his universe evil. He showed that the shadow is truly formidable, that its gravity is absolute, and that human strength, when left entirely to its own devices, will always, eventually find its limit and fail. But this realization leaves us standing on the very edge of a deep philosophical abyss. If the ring could not be resisted, if the location made failure inevitable, and if the strongest and purest will was destined to crack before the fire, then the quest was fundamentally doomed from the very moment the Fellowship left Rivendell. The architecture of the plan was built upon a structural impossibility. They were marching toward a destination where victory was mathematically barred. And yet, the ring was destroyed. The Dark Lord did fall. The shadows were swept away from the face of the earth. How do we resolve this profound, agonizing paradox? If the hero failed, and if its strength was completely exhausted, what hidden mechanism within the architecture of Arda stepped forward to alter the fate of the world? The answer is not found in the strength of arms, nor is found in the calculations of the wise. It is hidden in a concept that modernity has entirely forgotten, a concept that operates quietly beneath the surface of the myth, waiting for the exact moment when human capacity completely ends. To discover that mechanism, we must step away from the roaring fires of the volcano, and we must examine the small, quiet, and seemingly insignificant choices made in the dark, long before the journey ever began. If we accept the brutal mathematical premise established in our previous chapter, if we accept that the ring's gravity was absolute, and that Frodo's failure at the crack of doom was an unavoidable theological certainty, we are immediately confronted with a profound, almost paralyzing paradox. If the quest was fundamentally impossible from a psychological and physical standpoint, why was it ever undertaken? The Council of Elrond. The Council of Elrond, held in the quiet sanctuary of Rivendell, was not an assembly of naive children. It was a gathering of the oldest, wisest, and most battle-hardened minds in the history of Middle-earth. Elrond had witnessed the catastrophic fall of the First Age. Gandalf possessed the wisdom of the angelic Maya. They knew exactly what the ring was. They knew the terrifying, crushing mechanics of the shadow better than anyone. They understood the geography of Mordor, and they knew the frailty of the hobbits. If we look after their decision through the lens of modern, pragmatic logic, the strategy to send two halflings into the heart of a heavily fortified demonic empire with the ultimate weapon of the enemy is not merely a desperate gamble. It is an act of supreme, inexcusable folly. It is a suicide mission that actively endangers the entire world. And yet, Gandalf himself openly admits this during the council. Despair or folly, he says. It's not despair, for despair is only for those who see the end beyond all doubt. We do not. It is wisdom to recognize necessity when all other courses have been wasted, tough as folly it may appear to those who cling to false hope. To decode this enigmatic statement and to understand the psychological engine that drove the hobbits into the dark, we must consult the very language that Tolkien created. We must look at the vocabulary of the elves. In the Elvish tongues, specifically in Sindarin and Quenya, there is no single encompassing word for the English concept of hope, because Tolkien was a philologist who understood the extreme nuances of human emotion. He divided the concept of hope into two entirely distinct, philosophically opposed categories. The first of these is called Amdir. Amdir translates literally as looking up or looking ahead. It is the hope of calculation. It is an expectation of a good outcome based upon observable evidence, historical precedents, and rational analysis. It is the hope of the farmer who plants a seed in a fertile soil, looks at the clear sky, and possesses Amdir that there will be a harvest. It is the hope of a general who stands on a hill, looks down at his massive, well-equipped army, and possesses Amdir that he will win the battle tomorrow. Amdir is entirely bound to the physical world. It relies on the laws of cause and effect. It is the practical, everyday hope that allows civilizations to function. But there is a fatal flaw hidden within the architecture of Amdir, because it is rooted entirely in physical evidence. It is incredibly fragile. When the evidence turns against you, when the crops wither in a sudden frost, or when the enemy army crests the ridge with overwhelmingly superior numbers, Amdir shatters. When rational hope runs out of data to support it, it collapses instantly into its direct opposite, despair. To perfectly understand the catastrophic failure of Amdir, we only need to look at the tragic failure of Denethor, the ruling steward of Gondor. Denethor is not a villain. He is a brilliant, highly educated, and fiercely capable leader. But he is a strict, pragmatic rationalist. He governs his city and plans his wars based entirely on cold, hard facts. And tragically, Denethor possesses a palantir, a seeing stone that allows him to look across vast distances. When Denethor looks into the stone, Sauron does not lie to him. The Dark Lord simply shows the steward the mathematical truth of the board. He shows him the endless, sprawling armies of orcs, the towering siege engines, and the vast fleets of corsairs assembling in the south. Denethor looks at the data. He calculates the forces of Gondor, and he calculates the forces of Mordor. He realizes that math is absolute. The survival of his city is a statistical impossibility. His Amdir, his rational expectation of victory based on evidence, is completely annihilated. Because Denethor operates exclusively on logic, the collapse of his Amdir drives him into total, suffocating despair. He believes that fighting is pointless, and in his madness, he attempts to burn himself and his son alive on a funeral pyre before the enemy can even breach the gates. Denethor falls not because he is weak, but because he is too rational. He demands a guarantee of victory that the world simply cannot provide. But There is a second word for hope in the Elvish language, a word that operates outside the boundaries of mathematics, logic, and physical evidence. That word is Estel. Estel translates as trust. It is not an expectation of a specific, favorable outcome. It is not the belief that you will win the battle or that you will survive the winter. Estel is a profound, irrational, and unshakable trust in the fundamental nature of reality itself. It is a deeply theological and stoic concept. Estel is the belief that the universe was authored by a benevolent creator, Eru Iluvatar, and that because the author is ultimately good, overarching narrative of the world must also be good, even if the current chapter is filled with agonizing pain and impenetrable darkness. If Amdir is the belief that we will survive because we have the superior strategy, then Esther is the belief that we will do what is morally right, regardless of whether we survive or not, because doing what is right possesses an absolute intrinsic value. Esther does not require evidence. In fact, it shines brightest precisely when all physical evidence suggests that the situation is utterly hopeless. It is the bridge between human limitation and divine grace. It was Esther that drove the Council of Elrond. They looked at the board. They acknowledged that Amdir was completely dead, and they chose to act anyway. They chose to send the ring into the fire not because they rationally believed it would succeed, but because it was the only morally pure choice left to them. Everything else was a compromise with the shadow. And it is Esther that beats within the chests of the hobbits. If we look closely at Frodo and Sam during their agonizing trek through dead marshes and into the ash of Gorgoroth, we notice something deeply heartbreaking, yet incredibly magnificent. They do not possess a single drop of Amdir. They are not foolishly optimistic. They do not talk about the grand celebrations they will have when they return home as conquering heroes. As they climb the razor-sharp stairs of Thirit Ungol, Frodo is fully aware that it is a one-way trip. He knows, with absolute certainty, that even if he manages to cast the ring into the fire, he will not have the strength or the provisions to walk back out of Mordor. He has accepted his own death, and yet he keeps putting one bleeding foot in front of the other. But the most perfect cinematic realization of Estel in the entire mythology is given to Samwise Gamgee in one of the darkest chapters of the book. While deep within the hostile, suffocating borders of Mordor, Sam lies awake in the jagged rocks. The sky above him is choked with volcanic ash and thick, poisonous clouds. The air is heavy with the malicious will of Sauron. He is starved, dehydrated, and utterly terrified. The physical world offers him absolutely no evidence of comfort. But for a brief, fleeting moment, the dark clouds shift, and through a sudden rift in the ash, Sam sees a single white star twinkling in the infinite blackness above. Tolkien writes, "The beauty of it smote his heart as he looked up out of the forsaken land, and hope returned to him. For like a shaft, clear and cold, The thought pierced him that in the end the shadow was only a small and passing thing. There was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach. That is Estel. Sam does not look at the star and think, we are going to survive this and go back to the Shire. The star does not magically give him food, or water, or a map to Mount Doom. It does not change the physical reality of his agonizing situation in the slightest. But it completely shifts his philosophical perspective. It reminds him that Sauron, despite his vast armies and his terrifying ring, is not the author of the universe. The Dark Lord is merely a localized rebel. He is a small, passing shadow crawling across a canvas that is infinitely larger and infinitely more beautiful than he could ever comprehend. The light of that star exists outside of Sauron's jurisdiction, and because the light exists, Sam's suffering has meaning. He realizes that they are participating in a grand cosmic narrative. He accepts that his role in the story might simply be to suffer, to protect his friend, and to die in the dark so the light above can continue to shine for someone else in a future age. He lays his head back down on the cold stone and he sleeps. He surrenders to the architecture of the world. Estel is the supreme, ultimate defense against the shadow. The ring can corrupt ambition. It can twist a desire to do good into a desire to control. It can crush the physical body with its relentless gravity. But it cannot touch a soul that has completely surrendered its need for a guaranteed outcome. It cannot break a creature that has already accepted its own death out of pure love for another. Estel is the engine that carried the hobbits across a death continent. It pushed them through the mud, over the jagged glass of the mountain, and all the way to the suffocating heat of the Samath Naur. It got them to the door. But Estel is merely an attitude of the heart. It is not an infinite supply of physical energy. It allowed them to accept their fate, but it could not rewrite the laws of physics, nor could it shield Frodo's mind from the absolute crushing radiation of the ring at ground zero. The hobbits did everything that mortal creatures could possibly do. They walked until their bodies failed. They held on to trust until their minds shattered. They dragged the world to the very edge of salvation. But they could not push it over the cliff. As we approach the final agonizing moment inside Mount Doom, we must now observe what happens when Estel brings the hero to the end of his strength, when the will finally breaks, and the universe itself is forced to step in to catch him. We have finally reached the end of the geography. We have climbed the jagged razor-sharp stairs of Cirith Ungol. We have crawled across the toxic, ash-choked plains of Gorgoroth, and we have stepped through the dark, ancient stone portal into the Samath Naur, the Chambers of Fire, the very womb of the Shadow. I want you to forget the grand cinematic orchestrations for a moment. I want you to strip away the distant thunder of armies clashing at the Black Gate, and I want you to sit with the absolute terrifying isolation of this specific geometric coordinate. Inside the mountain, there is no grand audience. There are no cheering crowds, no inspiring banners, and no wisest counselors to offer guidance. There is only a dark, yawning chasm filled with the low, rhythmic roaring of primordial fire. There is only the suffocating, sulphurous heat that tears the throat, the thick, black smoke that blinds the eyes, and two small, broken halflings standing on a narrow tongue of rock over the abyss. This is the absolute architecture crucible of Tolkien's moral universe. Everything that has preceded this moment, every spoken syllable, every ancient ruin mapped, every cosmic horde sung by the Ainur, has been leading to this singular, terrifying seconds on the clock. To truly appreciate the psychological horror of this threshold, we must observe the profound transformation that has occurred within Frodo Baggins. He is no longer the respectable hobbit of Bag End. He is no longer even the determined traveler who left Rivendell. The ring has completed its structural demolition of his identity. Tolkien writes that as Frodo stood at the ring, he was entirely spent. He was a ghost inhabiting a decrepit, starving frame. The will of fire in his mind has consumed every memory of green fields, every recollection of peace, and every capacity for rational thought. He was holding on to his consciousness by a single, microscopic thread of raw, automated momentum. He had achieved impossible. He had carried the absolute concentration of cosmic malice through the heart of Mordor, arriving at the one place in the universe where the ring's gravitational pull was absolute. And it is precisely here, at the maximum boundary of human capacity, that Tolkien introduces a narrative event that constitutes the outstanding triumph of psychological realism. When Frodo stands over the fire, he does not face a traditional choice. He does not calmly weigh the options in his mind, debating whether to save the world or succumb to evil. The concept of choice implies agency. It implies a functioning will that possesses the freedom to select its direction. But, as we established in our previous chapter, under the crushing gravity of Ground Zero, Frodo's free will had completely ceased to exist. The support beam had reached its ultimate breaking strain. Consider the terrifying cosmic shift that occurs the exact moment Frodo Baggins yields to the pressure. He stands at the edge, his dark eyes hollow, reflecting the red glare of the chasm. He turns to Sam, his voice sounding completely detached, stolen by a power far greater than his own. "I have come," he says, "but I do not choose now to do what I came to do. I will not do this deed. The ring is mine." And he slips the gold band onto his finger. In that precise millisecond, the entire architecture of Middle-earth fractures. For centuries, Sauron had been operating on a fundamental, arrogant blind spot, because he is an entity driven entirely by the lust for power and domination. He could not conceive of a mindset that did not share his ambition. The idea that anyone who would look at the One Ring, the ultimate instrument of absolute control, and the desire only to destroy it, was a concept that could not compute within his black intellect. He assumed his enemies would try to use it against him. He was looking at the borders, looking at the armies, looking at the kings. But the moment Frodo puts the ring on inside the Sammath Naur, the veil is violently ripped away. Tolkien describes this moment with an astonishing, breathless prose that ranks among the greatest writing in the English language. The moment the ring is claimed at ground zero, its malignant signal flares with the intensity of a dying star, and miles away, atop his towering citadel of Barad-dûr, the Dark Lord is suddenly struck by a catastrophic, absolute realization. The eye of Sauron flies toward the mountain. His immense, sweeping gaze, which had been fixed on the battlefield at the Black Gate, snaps back to the absolute center of his realm. Tolkien writes that a sudden, piercing panic tore through the Dark Lord's vast consciousness. He realized that the magnitude of his own blindness. He saw the tiny, insignificant hobbits standing within the very forge of his doom, and his entire empire trembles. His armies faltered, his captains stood paralyzed, and his colossal mind was suddenly emptied of all thoughts of war, completely consumed by a helpless, suffocating terror. He summons the Nazgûl, the 8 ring-rats, riding their monstrous winged beasts, turn away from the battle in a frantic, desperate frenzy, tearing through the ash-choked skies toward Mount Doom in a hopeless race against time. But inside the chamber, Frodo Baggins has vanished from physical sight. He has stepped into the Twilight Realm. He has claimed the Shadow, and by claiming it, he has sealed his own doom. We must look at this moment not with the judgment of a moralist, but with the profound pity of the cartographer. Frodo did not fail because he was corrupt. He failed because he was mortal. He had given 99% of his entire being to the world. He had performed a miracle of pure endurance that no line of legendary Noldor elves or Numenoran kings could have ever duplicated. He did the absolute dirtiest, heaviest, and most agonizing work in the history of myth. He carried the bomb all the way to the core. But at the final 1%, the machine of his mind simply broke. If the story ends here, if the ring-wraiths arrive, slaughter the hobbits, and recover the ring from Frodo's corpse, then Tolkien's universe collapses into pure, unadulterated nihilism. It would mean that the shadow is ultimately omnipotent, that human effort is fundamentally meaningless, and that the universe is nothing but a cold, mechanical prison where the weak are destined to be crushed by the strong. It would mean that Estel, that profound, irrational trust in a benevolent creator, was nothing but a cruel, pathetic lie. Frodo had reached the absolute end of his strength. His will was gone. His agency was neutralized. The human hero had done everything he could, and it was officially not enough. The support beam had collapsed, and the stone was failing. When human capacity reaches absolute zero, when the strongest will shatters and the hero falls into the dark, the architecture of Arda demands that a hidden, invisible dimension of reality must step forward to catch the falling world. It is the moment where the horizontal axis of human effort ends, and the vertical axis of divine grace must intersect the narrative. But Ere Ilúvatar does not send a lightning bolt from the sky. He does not dispatch an army of angels to smite the Dark Lord. Tolkien's theology is far more subtle, far more beautiful, and far more profound than a cheap deus ex machina. The salvation of the world does not arrive through an act of supreme power. It arrives through the lingering, unexpected echo of a choice made in the dark years before the quest had ever been conceived. As Frodo stands invisible at the edge, and Sam sinks into absolute despair, a sudden, wild shadow leaps from the darkness. A decrepit, wretched, and completely miserable creature attacks the air, desperate to reclaim his precious. Gollum has arrived. And with his arrival, the severe mechanics of absolute mercy are about to rewrite the fate of the universe. We are left standing inside the suffocating cavern of the Samath Naur, suspended in a monument of absolute, terrifying failure. The horizontal axis of human effort has completely run out of track. Frodo Baggins has claimed the ring. He has put it on, vanishing into the twilight realm, and miles away, the dark consciousness of Sauron is screaming in absolute panic as the Nazgul tear through the ash-choked skies. But by every metric of classical storytelling, the tragedy is complete. The support beam has snapped. The hero has fallen. And yet, as we know, this is not where the story ends. The canvas of Arda is not permitted to sink into absolute nihilistic darkness. But because Tolkien rigidly maintained the inner consistency of his reality, he could not allow Frodo to suddenly change his mind. He could not permit a cheap, illogical burst of magical willpower to reverse the absolute gravity of Ground Zero. The laws of his universe demanded that Frodo was entirely neutralized as an autonomous agent of good. So, if the hero is entirely broken, and if the physical strategy has completely failed, what is the hidden mechanism that steps forward to rewrite the script of the world? The answer lies in a profound theological concept that Tolkien actually invented a specific word to describe. He called it eucatastrophe. To understand the architecture of eucatastrophe, we must analyze its structural mechanism. Tolkien defined it as a sudden, miraculous, and entirely unexpected turn in a narrative. It is not a cheap deus ex machina, where a god drops from the clouds to solve a problem with raw, unearned power. A catastrophe is something far more beautiful and far more structurally rigorous. It is a sudden alignment of the narrative tracks where the very choices, failures, and limitations of the characters are suddenly woven together by an unseen, benevolent hand to produce a victory that is completely beyond all rational hope. It is the sudden, blinding realization that the darkness, despite its immense volume, does not possess the final word. But Ilúvatar, the supreme author of Arda, does not achieve this turn through any display of martial strength. In the theology of Middle-earth, the ultimate victory over absolute evil is achieved through the long, quiet, and compounding lineage of a single, deeply fragile virtue, mechanics of total pity. To trace the deep roots of this cosmic mechanism, we must leave the burning forge of Mount Doom behind, and we must travel decades backward in time. We must descend into a cold, pitch-black subterranean cavern beneath the misty mountains, where a young, frightened hobbit named Bilbo Baggins is crawling on his hands and knees. This is the exact geographic and historical matrix where the fate of the War of the Ring was actually decided. Bilbo has just discovered a cold, golden ring in the dark. He is attempting to find his way out of the tunnels when he suddenly encounters a wretched, slime-covered and entirely abject creature named Gollum. Gollum blocks the exit. Bilbo stands behind him, invisible, holding a gleaming elven blade in his hand. The path is clear. The mathematics of survival are incredibly simple. If Bilbo draws his sword and slays this wretched creature, he can walk out into the sunlight and save his own life. Gollum is a murderer. He is a thief. He is an abject monster who would gladly devour the hobbit if given the chance. By every standard of pragmatic justice, Gollum deserves to die. Bilbo raises his sword. The blade is sharp. The opportunity is absolute. But as he looks down at the miserable, weeping form of his enemy in the dark, a sudden, miraculous wave of pure empathy washes through his heart. He does not see a monster to be eliminated. He sees a creature trapped in the ultimate, agonizing prison of his own misery. He sees a mirror of his own potential fragility. Tolkien writes that pity stays his hand. Bilbo chooses to restrain his power. He chooses to embrace the absolute irrationality of mercy. Instead of striking a lethal blow, he takes a wild, desperate leap over the creature's head, escaping into the light and leaving Gollum alive in the dark. Years later, sitting in the quiet safety of Bag End, a young Frodo Baggins hears the story from Gandalf. And Frodo, operating on the simplistic horizontal logic of human justice, reacts with anger. What a pity Bilbo didn't stab that vile creature when he had the chance, Frodo cries. And Gandalf responds with a passage of theological wisdom that serves as the absolute, unshakable spiritual anchor of the entire mythology. Pity. It was pity that stayed his hand. Pity and mercy. Not to strike without necessity. And he has been well rewarded, Frodo. Be sure that he took so little hurt from the evil and escaped it in the end, because he began his ownership of the ring so, with pity. Frodo persists, arguing that Gollum is loathsome and deserves nothing but death, and Gandalf delivers the ultimate verdict. Deserves it? I dare say he does. Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserves life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be too eager to deal out death in judgment, for even the very wise cannot see all ends. I have not much hope that Gollum can be cured before he dies, but there is a chance of it, and he is bound up with the fate of the ring. My heart tells me that he has some part to play yet, for good or ill, before the end, and when that comes, the pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of many, yours not least. You must observe how this seed of pity, planted by Bilbo in the dark, begins to germinate within Frodo's own soul across his long, agonizing journey. When Frodo finally encounters Gollum in the rocky wastes of the Emyn Muil, he has the perfect opportunity to fulfill his original desire. Gollum is caught. He is at Frodo's mercy. Samwise Gamgee, ever the practical pragmatist, immediately urges Frodo to slay the creature, or tie him up and leave him to starve. Sam sees Gollum exclusively as a security threat, a betrayal, waiting to happen. But as Frodo looks down at the weeping, shattered creature, he suddenly hears the distant echoing voice of Gandalf in his memory. He looks at Gollum, and because Frodo is already beginning to feel the heavy continuous radiation of the ring pulling at his own mind, he experiences a sudden, terrifying flash of recognition. He does not see an alien monster. He sees his own future. He sees what the ring will inevitably do to him if the quest drags on for too long. Frodo chooses to replicate the mercy of Bilbo. He spares Gollum. He tames him with kindness, treats him with a fragile dignity, and allows him to act as a guide. This is the ultimate hidden architecture of the quest. Frodo is not just carrying a bomb to a volcano. He is continuously generating a field of total mercy across the landscape. He allows Gollum to betray him. He endures his paranoia, and even at the very base of Mount Doom, when Gollum attacks him out of pure, unadulterated greed, Frodo chooses once again to restrain his hand. He refuses to execute the monster. And now, we return to the Samas Naur, the final seconds of the world. Frodo has claimed the ring. He is invisible. Free will is dead. The plan has completely collapsed. The support beam has shattered into ash. But because Frodo had continuously chosen the path of pity, because he had repeatedly refused to deal out death in judgment, the wretched tool of salvation is present inside the chamber. Gollum leaps through the smoke. He does not see the invisible hobbit, but his absolute, mad obsession allows him to track his prey by scent and sound. He tackles the invisible form of Frodo, and a desperate, animalistic struggle takes place on the very edge of the abyss. Gollum is not fighting to save Middle-earth. He is not an agent of the light. He is driven entirely by his own absolute consuming addiction. He pins Frodo to the rock. He brings his sharp, decayed teeth down, and he violently bites the ring of Frodo's finger. Gollum holds the golden prize aloft. He sees his precious bag in his hands. He is completely consumed by a manic, ecstatic, and blinding joy. He dances wildly on the very brink of the roaring chasm, completely oblivious to his surroundings, stepping backward and forward in a state of pure, absolute euphoria. And then he steps too far. His foot slips on the wet, ash-covered stone. He loses his balance, and he falls backward into the yawning abyss of fire. Tolkien writes that as Gollum plunged into the depths, his final echoing scream was a cry of triumph. Precious! And then the fire swallowed him. The ring dissolved into the primordial crucible of its creation. The dark tower of Barad-dûr collapsed into ruin, the foundations of Mordor shattered, and the great shadow that had suffocated the face of the earth for thousands of years was suddenly scattered like dust before a cleansing wind. Look at the astonishing profound irony of the architecture. The ring was not destroyed by a display of heroic strength. It was not cast into the fire by the unbreakable will of a righteous protagonist. It was destroyed by the operation of its own absolute consuming evil. It was greed that destroyed the ring. It was addiction that pulled it into the fire. Evil, in the ultimate philosophy of Tolkien, is fundamentally self-destructive. When left completely to its own devices, will always eventually consume itself. But here is the absolute theological core of the entire essay. Evil can only destroy itself if the good characters provide the structural framework of mercy that allows it to happen. If Bilbo had stabbed Gollum in the dark, if Frodo had executed him in the Emyn Muil, if Sam had cut his throat on the stairs of Cirith Ungol, the quest would have failed. If Gollum had been dead, there would have been no one inside the Samad Naur to tackle the invisible, broken hero. There would have been no one to bite the ring from his finger. Frodo would have stood at the edge, the Nazgul would have arrived, and the shadow would have triumphed forever. Salvation was achieved not because the heroes were strong enough to conquer the dark, but because they were merciful enough to tolerate the broken. The true architect of victory was not the sword of Aragorn nor the magic of Gandalf. It was a silent, compounding sequence of small, quiet choices to show mercy to a wretched, unlovable monster. It was the realization that in the grand design of Eru Ilúvatar, no act of true pity is ever entirely wasted. Power failed. Willpower cracked. The hero fell. But love, mercy, and pity endured, and because they endured, they caught the world as it fell into the abyss. As the roar of the volcano dies away into silence, and the great maps of Mordor crumble into dust, we are left looking at the two small hobbits sitting on a solitary rock, surrounded by a sea of flowing lava, waiting for their own inevitable death. They have saved the world, but as the fire burns out, we must now examine the final, most painful foundation of this entire architectural marvel. We must discover the true price of this victory, because the road back to the Shire is long, and as we will see in our final chapter, for the hero who carried the weight of the dark, the home he saved will never truly be home again. The ring is unmade. The Dark Tower has fallen. The king has returned to his throne in Minas Tirith, and the great sweeping mythological war that consumes the Third Age of Middle-earth is finally over. In the realm of modern pop culture, this is precisely where the curtain falls. We are conditioned to expect the story to end at the coronation, bathed in sunlight, with the heroes receiving their medals, the crowds cheering, and the triumphant musical score promising a long, uninterrupted era of peace and happiness. We expect the hero's journey to end with a joyous return to normalcy. But Tolkien, the architect of this unyielding reality, knew that the applause eventually dies down. He knew that the banners fade, the crowds disperse, and the soldiers must eventually make the long, quiet walk back to their homes. And he knew with a terrible, intimate certainty that for those who have stood at the very epicenter of the darkness, there is no such thing as a return to normalcy. We must now examine the final, most painful foundation of Tolkien's philosophy. We must look at the price of saving the world. When the four hobbits finally return to the borders of the Shire, they find it changed, yes, but eventually it is restored. The trees are replanted, the fields are sown, Samwise Gamgee marries, he builds a family, and he begins to heal the earth with his own two hands. But Frodo Baggins is entirely alienated from the world he has sacrificed everything to protect. He walks through the green, familiar hills of his childhood, but he is no longer a part of them. The other hobbits look at him with a mixture of distant respect and fundamental misunderstanding. They cannot comprehend the depths of his exhaustion. They cannot see the invisible weight he still carries. Tolkien describes Frodo's post-war existence not as a triumphant retirement, but as a slow, agonizing fading. He is haunted by anniversaries. Every year, on the exact date he was stabbed by the Witch King at Weathertop, the physical pain returns, freezing his blood and rendering him bedridden. Every year, on the anniversary of his poisoning by Shelob, a dark, suffocating despair grips his mind. "I'm wounded," Frodo tells Gandalf. "It will never really heal." This is not the language of fantasy. This is not a magical curse that can be lifted by a clever spell. This is the clinical, devastating reality of chronic trauma. Frodo Baggins is suffering from a profound, incurable spiritual sickness. He is a casualty of a war that was fought inside his own mind. And it is here, in the quiet, fading twilight of Frodo's life in Middle-earth, that Tolkien delivers what is arguably the most heartbreaking and philosophically profound lines in the entire history of literature. As Frodo prepares to leave the Shire forever, to take the Elven ship into the West in a desperate search for peace, he turns to his dearest friend, Sam, and he explains the true nature of his heroism. He says, "I tried to save the Shire, and it has been saved, but not for me. It must often be so, Sam, when things are in danger. Someone has to give them up, lose them, so that others may keep them." I want you to let the waves of that realization settle into the silence of this room. This is the ultimate, uncompromising definition of sacrifice in the architecture of Arda. True heroism is not about winning a kingdom. It is not about earning eternal glory, and it is certainly not about securing your own happily ever after. True heroism is the grim, stoic acceptance that you are going to be broken in the process. It is the willingness to absorb the poison, to carry the crushing weight of the dark, and let it destroy your own capacity for happiness, simply so that the people you love can wake up tomorrow morning and tend their gardens in peace. Frodo gave up his own future so that the Shire could have one. The world was saved, but the Savior was ruined. And so we must follow him to the grey heavens. We must stand on the shores of the sea beneath a canopy of grey clouds and watch the white ship prepare to depart. This is the departure of the ring-bearers, Bilbo, Frodo, Gandalf, Galadriel, and Elrond. They are the artifacts of a fading age. They are too heavily burdened by memory, too wounded by the long defeat, and too exhausted by the gravity of Middle-earth to remain. They must pass into the West, stepping outside the circles of the world, in the hope that the undying lands can offer a sanctuary that the mortal shores cannot. As the ship sails away, slipping quietly into the mist, the Third Age officially ends. The magic leaves the world. The era of men begins, and Samwise Gamgee is left standing alone on the shore, weeping for the friend who had to die so that he could live. We have closed the ledger of the tragedy of Frodo Baggins. We have mapped the anatomy of the shadow, the mechanics of pity, and the terrible price of victory. But as we sit here in the dark, watching the final embers of this fire die out, we are left with a lingering, deeply unsettling question. Why does the pain of Frodo Baggins feel so agonizingly real? Why does his inability to return to normal life his haunting anniversaries and his invisible wounds resonate with such a terrifying clinical accuracy? Because, my friends, this pain was not invented, it was inherited. When John Ronald Reuel Tolkien wrote about the suffocating ash of Mordor, he was not simply imagining a dark fantasy realm. When he wrote about the dead marshes, where the pale, rotting faces of fallen soldiers stared up from the stagnant, muddy water, he was not inventing a ghost story. He was remembering. He was remembering the summer of 1916. He was remembering the unimaginable, mechanized slaughter of the Battle of the Somme. He was remembering the sight of his closest friends being torn apart by shrapnel, drowning in the mud of Flanders, and suffocating in the yellow clouds of mustard gas. The ring-bearer's incurable trauma, the shell shock that alienated Frodo from the green hills of his youth, was the exact same trauma that haunted a generation of young men who returned from the trenches of Europe, only to find that their souls had been permanently left behind in the mud. Our journey through the idealistic myth of Arda is over. We have seen the heights of Elven philosophy and the beauty of divine mercy. But next week, when we return to this study, we will not be opening a book of fairy tales. We will be opening a history of nightmares. We will trace the physical, bloody fingerprints of the First World War across the pages of Lord of the Rings. We will discover how the darkest chapter of human history birthed the greatest work of modern fantasy. We will map the trenches. We will walk into the dead marshes. Join me next time for Echoes of the Trenches. Until then, keep your fires lit and sleep well if you can. The rain is still falling.